Welcome to the Computer Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is Gary McGraw, and he will talk about BSIMM, the Building Security in Maturity model. Gary.
Hi. Hi, everybody. So I think I am going to escape the little hole and come stand over here and give you guys the talk. So BSIMM is about software security. And I'm coming at this problem from the commercial world as opposed to the academic world. And just to tell you a little bit about what I do so you know what this means. I work for a company called Cigital. We have offices in New York and Boston and Amsterdam and Silicon Valley, and headquarters is in Virginia. Got about 120 people, and we work almost exclusively on software quality and software security with huge companies that do software security initiatives and have large-scale software quality problems. I've written a whole bunch of books in computer security over the years, starting with Java security way back in 1996, if you see that one right there. And actually I gave a talk about that book here in 98 maybe, or 97, long ago, I think, before these things were even filmed. Yep. And then I gave another talk on this one in 2001. And was that the last time I was here, Spaff? I don't know. Seems like.
You've been here one more time in between.
Yeah, but I don't remember exactly what it was. But here I am to talk about my latest thinking in software security. And this thinking is definitely biased by what actually works out there in the world. So I started out as an academic, and I got my PhD in computer science and cognitive science down at IU Bloomington. Studied with Doug Hofstetter back in the day. I think I met you, Spaff, in 1995, something like that, when I started working in computer security for the first time. And I've really been doing computer security stuff ever since then. When I started in the field, there were just a few people that were saying, gosh, we really have a big engineering problem, and we got to build our stuff better. We have to test it appropriately. And the most famous of all of those people is sitting right here, who was talking about building better software. But really, there was not anywhere to go to talk about how to do it. We wrote this book, Building Secure Software, in '99. I wrote with John Viega, who's now the CTO of McAfee, I think, or the CSO or something. CSO of McAfee. He was my right-hand guy at Cigital for many years. And when we wrote that book, it was kind of a philosophy tome. It was saying, you know, software security. And the problem at that point was, if you went to the security guys and you said, what about software? They would point over there. And they would go, oh yeah, those damn software people. They keep building broken, horrible software, and they put it on our beautiful, pristine, wonderful network and screw the whole thing up. Plus the users. And they really hated the developers and the users in equal measure. And then if you went over to this side and you said, hey, developer people, security, they would go, oh yeah, we have some people that live down in the basement. They're the gnomes. I think they do it, the security gnomes. And so everybody was pointing like this, the trolls, at everyone else, and nobody was responsible for the job. Now, the good news is that things have changed a lot since then, and you used to have to give this talk motivating why software security is important and who ought to be doing it and what we ought to be doing. And today, I'm not going to belabor you with all that stuff. In fact, I want to start out with the first slide that says this. And we stole a line from the Declaration of Independence up there at the top. And these are things that I shouldn't have to convince you of now. These should be just self-evident, obvious stuff. The first is that software security is not about security functions. It's not about cryptography or authentication or any sort of mechanism. Mechanisms certainly play a role, but security is not a mechanism. It's not a thing. It's a property. And it turns out to be an emergent property of a whole system. Kind of like quality. It would be great if you could just have a quality thing and you would check the little quality thing in a pull-down menu, and all of a sudden quality would be up. You know, you could do the same thing for security. Just check the little security thing and security would be on. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. As you all know, Many developers don't know that yet, because developers have been taught for many, many years. We got any developers in the audience back here? No, all students, no developers? Oh well. Developers have been taught for many decades to think in terms of features and functions, because when it comes to planning a project or building an architecture, it's always described in terms of features and functions. So it's only natural to consider that developers would, when faced with security, think of security as a feature or function. It's just part of the way they think. So we still have to disavow them of that belief and get to this notion of emergent security, but I don't have to convince you guys of that, so I won't try to do so. The other thing you have to understand about software security is that problems in software come in two major varieties. One variety is bugs, that's implementation problems in code, and the other variety is flaws, that is problems in design. And both are kinds of software defect. But if you want to try to make sure that a program is defect-free, you have to concentrate on both aspects of those problems. You can't just go scanning the code with a static analysis tool and try to eradicate the bugs and expect that to lead to security, because then you're going to end up having lots of architectural issues. So that's another thing that I think the world understands at this point, and they, generally speaking, appear to be divided up about 50-50. And then the last thing, which is something that's pretty new, the last 5 years or so, is that if you want to do software security, if you want to practice software security as a developer or as a corporation or as any sort of entity, the way to do it is to integrate practices into the software development lifecycle. Now, this should be pretty obvious. I mean, that's why we hold these truths to be self-evident. So there are a lot of different methodologies for doing this. There's Microsoft's SDL methodology, there's OWASP CLASP, there's My Touchpoint stuff. There are many ways of doing it. PwC has one, Deloitte has one. Everybody has a way of talking about integrating security practices into the software development lifecycle. So those are the things that we're starting with, and let's move on from there. In fact, that's kind of the state of the practice around 2006. This book, Software Security, that I wrote came out, and 6 months later, Steve and Mike Howard wrote the SDL book, and OWASP came out around the same time. And basically, if you stand back and squint, this work looks very similar, because it says you should do things like review your code with a static analysis tool. You should do architectural risk analysis. Gosh, penetration testing is a good idea, but you should also do security testing at the unit level and the integration level. And these notions of stuff you ought to do in the SDLC, that is fairly well understood philosophy now. But if you think about it, where did this come from? Well, it turns out it came from thin air, and it was based on what I like to call faith-based software security. So there were various people that were running around promulgating different faiths, the popes of the different religions, and faith-based software security, generally speaking, works okay, but it's just based on faith and personality and convincing people that that's the way they ought to do it. And I stand guilty of being one of the promulgators of faith-based software security, but we don't have to do that anymore. And in fact, what happened to me was I was at a technical advisory board meeting a couple years ago at Fortify, and yet another software security religion was presented. It was going to be the way these guys say you should do software security, another faith-based approach. This is how you should do it. And I looked at it. It was a very cool thing, actually. It was a nice little model built by Pravir Chandra, and it was an interesting model. But the problem was, when I looked at it, I said, I've done 7 large-scale software security initiatives, and none of them did it this way. So in theory, you could do it that way, but nobody has done it that way in my own experience. So I said, well, have you guys actually done it? Oh, no. It's faith-based software security. And the sort of obvious thought is, why do it that way? Some people have been doing software security now for a decade in a formal manner, like Microsoft. The SDL thing, that project, the Microsoft Trustworthy Computing Initiative, is a decade old now. So why don't we just go and study the people that have been doing it and describe what we see? We'll call it science. So we want to transition faith-based software security into observation-based software security. Everybody see that move? And that's what this model is all about. Now there's a logo for the model, which is this bulldozer, and you can decide for yourself what it's pushing around. But it's brown, I'll tell you that. Pushing around some brown stuff. And this is a model, this is some work that I did jointly with Brian Chess, who is the chief scientist and co-founder of Fortify, and Sammy Miguez, who is a principal at Cigital. And we all three worked equally on this stuff. So the thing that I happen to know when I've been collecting for a few years is that there are a whole bunch of large-scale software security initiatives. By large-scale, I do not mean they have a guy who does code review on staff. Or, oh yeah, that's like, some guy down in the IT world every once in a while pops up and does a review of a system. Large-scale software security initiative means all the developers are using the same SDLC, they're using some best practices, they're tooling things up and automating things as much as possible. And in fact, there's a view from the executive management into what's going on in software security because it's that important to the corporation. Now, I'm aware of 46 programs like that. There's even more now, but this is a list of 46 that fits on a slide. And you can divide these companies into verticals. So you see that 26 of them are financial services companies, 7 are ISVs, that means independent software vendors, 6 are just general technology companies, a couple defense, 3 retail, 1 oil, and 1 we're not sure what they do because they do everything. That's GE. I'm not really sure what they do. So the thing is, since these guys have been doing it for a while, why don't we choose who we think is doing a good job and study them? And so, you can argue what a good job might mean and how we might argue that, or how we might pick that. Here's how I did it. I just picked the ones that I thought were the best, and I called them up and I said, guys, we're going to do a science experiment. We're going to come and talk to you about what you're doing in software security, and we're going to gather data. And then we're going to figure out what to do once we gathered the data. Are you in? And everybody I called said, yeah, we're in. And here are some of the companies that were involved. There are 2 that we can't name that are financial services firms, but some of these other firms you do know. And you know those 2 financial services firms too. They're sort of everyday household names. But Microsoft and Google in the same study, and the world didn't end. Adobe and Qualcomm. Qualcomm makes cell phone guts. Wells Fargo, just a small little bank. EMC, just another tiny little software company of a few billion. And then DTCC, which is always the mystery. Anybody know what DTCC does? They clear all of the transactions on Wall Street every day. And each year they do $1.8 quadrillion worth of transactions, which is 15 zeros. It's a whole lot of zeros. So you might imagine that software security is important to them. In fact, software security is important to all of these companies. And so here was the methodology that we followed. We picked these 9, we called them up, and we said, see, there used to be 35, 9 of 46. And we called them up and we said, we want to talk to you about what you do around software security. And we're going to use something that we call the software security framework to guide our conversation. You can think of the software security framework, which I'll show you in the next slide, as kind of a grid in archaeology. When you're doing archaeology, you take the thing and you stick like a tent peg in the ground and you draw some string and you make squares, and then you start digging, and wherever you find something interesting, you write down what square you found it in. So you know where you found these things. Well, that's what the software security framework is supposed to be for us. We did 9 in-person interviews that were a couple of hours each. Now, there was the advantage that I knew all these 9 guys for at least a decade, so the conversations were very straightforward. In fact, the thing that was the coolest to me about this work was how incredibly forthcoming everybody was. Because one of the problems in computer security is people are remiss to share. They're remiss to share their problems, they're remiss to share what they're doing and how they're managing their risks because they're afraid they might not be right. But if there's an opportunity to do it in a trusted way, in a way where everybody gets to share the data and they can learn from each other, it turns out to be possible. This is something that I know that you guys have done at CERIAS for years, and it's a great insight and a very important insight. So everybody agreed to do it, and we went and gathered data, and we had an open-ended conversation. Now I'm going to show you the model that we developed out of these data throughout the course of this talk. But here's what I want you to understand. We did not go and say, so how do you do training on introductory software security for all the developers? And do you do it when they start? That's not the way this interview thing went. Instead, it would be, gosh, you guys have 30,000 developers? How in the heck do you teach those guys? What do they know about software security? And then the conversation follows and you gather data. And when you hear something, you write it into the right quadrant of the software security framework. So this model that I'm going to describe is driven by the data. Got the data first, then we built a model. We didn't build a model and try to cram the data into it to justify our views or our own way. In fact, there were a couple things that surprised me about the data that we gathered. Here's number one. I believed going into this study that we would have to end up with two models, one for the ISVs and one for the financial services guys, and that those businesses were so diverse that surely they didn't approach software security the same way. Guess what? I was wrong. It turns out that the way Microsoft does code review is very similar to the way, say, well, I can't name these one guys. This unnamed financial services firm does it. And I mean, the results are in the same format. They use similar tools. It's a very, very interesting thing. And this is good because this means that we can draw some general activities out of software security that work for everybody. And I wasn't sure we were going to get that when we went out to get the data. So we ended up with 110 activities that we identified that are divided into this framework. And I'll tell you more about those in just a moment. But the notion was, once again, gather the data, build a model out of the data. And every step of the way, there were 3 interviewees, Sammy and myself and Brian. And we all went and participated in the same interview. I did all the question asking and guiding of the conversation. But later when we went to talk about the data, we would have big arguments over what we heard. And there were some interesting phenomena, like my friend Sammy, he has a photographic memory. And he's like a recorder. He remembers everything that everybody said. So Brian and I would be having an argument about interpretation of a certain thing that we thought we heard. And Sammy would always say, well, what that guy actually said was, and I quote, blah, 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 blah. And we go, oh, great, you know. But the good thing about these points of view, and something that we're preserving in the model to this day, is if you have separate points of view, and you build your results and then you combine them or you share them or you argue about them, it really makes you think carefully about your data. And we have to come to terms. So when we go and we do these interviews, we don't just by caveat roughshod score people. We have a huge knockdown, drag out fight over whether they should get credit for this or how that should be interpreted. And that's why what we're doing is Science E. It's as science-y as, say, anthropology is science. And in fact, we joke around as computer scientists and we call this our anthropology experiment. So let me show you the framework. Here's the framework. You can see that there are 12 practices in the bottom square there: strategy and metrics, compliance and policy, and so on. Those are divided into 4 large domains. The domains have names like governance, but let me tell you what they stand for. So governance is about running from a management perspective a large-scale initiative. And that involves a set of practices: strategy and metrics practices, compliance and policy practices, and training or staff development practices. Intelligence is about stuff you need to carry out software security. Like, if you're going to do static analysis with a static analysis tool looking for bugs, what do you need to know? What bugs look like, so you can put that into the tool. That's a piece of intelligence. And there are attack models and security features in design we put in there, and then standards and requirements like secure coding standards and so on. Then there are best practices of the sort that are described in software security or Microsoft's SDL book or OWASP, and those go in the SSDL pile. In fact, we called that SDL touchpoints to mergeify kind of Microsoft's approach and my approach. And Microsoft, when they saw that, they said, "Oh, you can't use SDL. That's sort of a Microsoft thing. That means our secure development lifecycle." I was like, "What? You know, you think you've already made a term like Band-Aid or Xerox? I don't think so, Steve." But Steve said, "Well, we really would prefer it if you called it something else." So I call it SSDL, which stands for Software Security Development Lifecycle, or Steve's Security Development Lifecycle. You know, your choice on that one. But some of those pretty common best practices: architecture analysis, which turns out to be very difficult and something that's hard; code review with a static analysis tool, or manual analysis; and security testing as carried out by developers and QA people, not as carried out by penetration testing people, which is something that shows up over here, post-deployment, or at the point of deployment. So we want to cover software security all the way from the executive level, all the way to a piece of software or an application that's actually deployed out in the field, and what you do during deployment to make sure that it is secure. So it's a pretty wide grid that we've drawn for ourselves, and the conversations that we had ranged around this archaeology grid, and we found out stuff, right? So we would note down what people said in a certain quadrant, and then we would synthesize those, and we synthesize those into a set of activities, 110 activities, which we observed. Which we observed. Let me say that again. Which we observed. This is a key thing to understand. When you go out in the jungle, you look in the trees, and you see some monkeys. The monkeys are eating bananas. What you observe is monkeys eat bananas. What you do not observe is bananas are good. You should only eat yellow bananas. Don't steal bananas from your friend. Don't run while you're eating bananas. None of that. No value judgments. Not, it's good if monkeys eat bananas. You know what? All we're saying is monkeys eat bananas. So in this model, when we say we observe this practice, we're not saying you should do this practice, or you better do this practice, or even this practice works. What we're saying is we observe this practice. Monkeys eat bananas. Everybody got that? This is completely different than how computer scientists usually tick. Usually computer scientists are trying to project their shoulda, woulda, couldas onto something, or you have a theory and then you build a model to support your theory, which is how most people's PhD theses work. You know, and the software engineering literature is a disaster because of this, because software is so bad that no matter what you do, it's going to find problems in software. So you can always publish, because software is so bad that your stupid idea will work. And it'll get published. And so you look at the software engineering literature, and that's what it looks like to me. I don't know. It's kind of sad. So let's turn that around. Let's just talk about what we see. Let's get away from value judgments and shouldas and faith-based software security and build it on observation. So just to kind of push this point further, we're trying to move to science, right? And what we're starting with is religion-ish. So anybody heard of cargo cults in here? SPAF, of course. I always have to explain this one. Only a few people know what this is. So during World War II, there were these islands, and these islands had indigenous populations on them. And when the Japanese were running around the Pacific, they would invade these islands and build a landing strip and fly their planes down, and so would the U.S. War would kind of go through the Pacific. And when the airplanes came to the island, the indigenous populations were like, dude, we like Spam. We like those airplane things. They bring us fuel. They bring us shiny beads. Airplanes are cool. Well, the war moved on, right? the airplanes stopped coming. But these people, they liked the airplanes. So they developed cults around airplanes, and they built like fake landing strips. And this is actually an airplane that they built out of palm fronds right there. And then they would do some ceremonies and hope to call the airplanes back to bring some more cool stuff. That's a cargo cult. Software security today is kind of like a bunch of cargo cults. There's people that fly around that are really good, like SPAF, and they give a talk and everybody gets excited, and then SPAF flies off and the cargo cult forms. And they start making stuff out of palm fronds. And please, press the little button.
So just as a note,
Yeah.
On my webpage for documents for grad students, I have a copy of Richard Feynman's address on cargo cults and science.
Beautiful.
So if any of you are interested,
Definitely
this
get
is
it.
exactly the topic.
It's a very, very important thing to understand, because what we want to do is move away from that and move towards, maybe we've gotten our way all the way to divining rods, right? But we don't really know how those work, or really if they work. They sort of seem to, but nobody's sure why, right? But compasses we understand. That's, we understand those. And most importantly of all, there's this thing called a measuring stick, or a thermometer. Let's talk about science. So where did thermometers come from? Well, there was this guy, Kelvin. He got a tube of mercury. It was just a tube of mercury. And he drew some lines on the tube of mercury, right? And then he started making some observations about how tall the mercury was when it was a certain number of lines. And after a while, at least two systems developed that people started using regularly. The Fahrenheit measurement system and the Celsius measurement system, and they're completely arbitrary, just like meters or yards. It's just a stick with some lines on it. So a thermometer is a tube of mercury with some lines on it, but if we all use it the same way every time, that's how we can begin to build hypotheses and then disprove them or prove them later. And that's what science is about. So what we wanted to do for software security, and this is a rather big undertaking, is to just build a yardstick and have people use the same yardstick to describe what it is that they're doing. So you can think of the BSIMM resulting model as a yardstick for software security. And it seems to be being used that way now, but that's our big plan in the sky to move away from cargo cult security. I got to get a copy of that paper. I always read Feynman's paper about the space shuttle, which is also a good one. But I didn't know the cargo cults one, so I got to get that. Okay. We found some stuff out as a side effect of this work, which was pretty cool. Like, we did ask them, how long you been doing this, how many people you got, and how are they organized, and how many developers are there. And when you do this, you can actually make some observations that provide hard data, which are really interesting. For example, every single one of these initiatives has a centralized software security group. Now, does that mean that you can't do a software security initiative without a software security group? No. What that means is the ones that we observed all have one. They seem to think it works. All right? Everybody clear on that? So, some people come to us and say, should we have one? Well, you want to be like those guys? They have one. And that's all you can say, really. Right? So the smallest one that we observed was a group of 12 guys. The largest one was a group of 100 people. And you can see the median there. Now, the really interesting thing happens when you take the SSG size and you put it over the developer size, and you do a ratio. So we're talking about large groups of developers. The smallest one was 450 developers, and the largest was 30,000 developers. The interesting thing is, when you do the math with all of the real data, you can make a statement, which is that what we observed is that the SSG size seems to be around 1% of the developer size. So people used to come to us and they would say, how many software security guys do I need? And you know what? As consultants, we would never say, I don't know. We would always say, oh, let me invent some sort of answer for you. What's your budget, or whatever. But really now we have a real number that came out of this data. We can say, well, we've observed that 1% seems to be right. How many developers do you have to control, right? Or teach, or get to think about software security? That's cool. That's a really cool side effect of this work. And in fact, when we revealed that number to the guys in the study, they were totally psyched, especially one major bank in New York who was getting ready to do a big round of layoffs. And they found out that their SSG was already too small, according to what everybody else had, and they used that in the layoff meeting. They said, I can't lay off my software security guys. I don't really even have an, in fact, I need 5 more. Really, very interesting. And it did, in fact, work. Well, it worked because the guy is also the guy. I'll tell you who he is later. But he had real data to back him up. The other thing that we observed is what we call a satellite. The satellite is people who do software security that are in the development groups. They might be enterprise architects. They might be testing people who are interested in security. They might be people that are security people assigned to a particular development group. The satellite is the halo around the software security group. And though we haven't published this, one observation that we know is that things tend to start out centralized. And over time, as can I go out? I can go out, right? Just go out and tell them. Dun, da, da, da. See, I did step out of the room, just for the record. So the thing that we observed is that starting out centralized is good, and we didn't disappear. That centralizing control is very important, and figuring out how to carve up the problem is important. But as things mature, they get more distributed, and developer groups start to take over some of the responsibilities. For example, the developers might be charged with doing code review with a static analysis tool themselves, right? So that's no longer the software security group's centralized role. It gets distributed out in the organization. And so you can see the satellite size up there too. Those are some things that we observed, which were pretty cool data. We also found some surprising stuff. Now, this isn't part of the model, and I don't want to spend very much time on this slide. So there are 10 things that we observed that kind of surprised me, and they're rank ordered here from the least surprising thing at number 1 to the most surprising thing at number 10. As far as this is just my own perception, but all these things I found surprising. So take a quick look at that, and let's figure out one to talk about. You can pick one. Anybody? Yell it out. Got one? Pen testing. Pen testing is diminishing. That's number 9. What we found is that everybody does pen testing. So you have to do it, and you shouldn't not do it. But the role of pen testing changes as a software security organization matures. There are 2 reasons for this. One is if you're finding defects earlier in the software development lifecycle, it's cheaper to find the defects then and eradicate them. And there's less to find when it comes to penetration testing, generally speaking. So it's not as effective. That's one reason. The other reason is that pen testing is late life cycle. These are both economic reasons. It happens at the end. If you find a problem in a pen test, you got to go all the way back and figure out where the heck that problem was, what made it happen, and fix the problem, and find other problems that are like that problem. So pen testing happens a little bit too late, but it's an important technology. It's an important approach, and it can't just go away. So it doesn't disappear. The role diminishes over time. In the beginning, it's really important, and here's why. Nobody believes they have a software security problem. Everybody believes there is a software security problem, but not with their software, right? So, oh yeah, those Microsoft guys, terrible, yeah, terrible. You know, the Adobe guys, oh yeah, terrible Microsoft. And the Microsoft guys, oh, the Adobe guys, terrible. Everybody thinks everybody else's code is broken. Penetration testing is like a flaming, smoking, smoldering disaster that you cannot ignore. And if you want somebody to fix their software, you take a penetration testing result and you just put it on their table and you go, look, this is your code, all right? Got it? It's not, We're not talking in abstractions here. So that's why it's a useful thing to get started with. But the role we found is diminishing over time, and sometimes it gets given to specialists. In fact, in one organization, they intentionally hire hardcore pen testing people who reverse stuff and really just break the bejesus out of software in surprising ways in order to find new and surprising ways of breaking stuff, because they want to refresh their thinking about attacks and bad guys and how that works. And that's kind of that's a level 3 activity, way up there in the rocket science land. Right? So there were a bunch of other surprising things. There's an article about that you can get on the website, bsi-mm.com, that describes all those surprising things. Okay, so back to the model. Well, we observed 110 activities, and not only did we observe them, but we described them with examples. So we're not going to produce a model that says, code review with a static analysis tool is a good idea. What we're going to say is, code review with a static analysis tool appears to be a common activity, and here's an example of how one company actually does it. So in the heart of this model is a description, a 1-paragraph description of every activity that has not only the activity itself, but the reason that you do it, which is an objective. Why would you do that anyway? And the objective is in business speak, so you can use it to justify stuff up the chain, which is a very sneaky good trick. Then it has a real example. So data-driven model with actual data describing actual ways that we saw these activities in practice. That's kind of an interesting thing. Let me give you an example. So back to the framework. Remember, this is our archaeology grid. We can decide to go into any one of these domains. In fact, there's a clickable version of the model on the website at bsi-mm.com. But you can, let's just say we choose training. Let's look at the activities under training. There's a skeleton level view. This is just a very quick way of looking at all of the activities, and you can see that there are 9, 10, 11, 12 activities for training. Remember, 110? Where'd that come from? What do you think? Well, that's how many we observed. If it was a nice balanced model, there would be 10. 10 in each practice, and it would be 120, and they would be it would be a nice little crystal. Well, guess what? It isn't like that. We saw 110 things, and they don't divide up into the practices equally. In fact, training has 12. Why? Because training has 12. That's why, because that's what we observed. Now, we also organize these into levels, and here's where things get a little bit messy. But the levels are like this. They're not like the CMM levels, level 1, level 2, and level 3 of the CMMI. I really just don't believe that Watts's view of building perfect software and coming up with perfect requirements and then it will also be secure is sane. I think that's insane and wrong. So I don't promulgate that out there. On the other hand, our levels are like this. So level 1 stuff is easy. Oh, anybody could do that. Really, that's a level 1 thing. That's easy. Level 2 stuff is probably you should do a level 1 thing before you attempt a level 2 thing, just because maybe it would get you on the road to doing that better. So level 2 stuff requires level 1 stuff in some capacity. Level 3 stuff, rocket science. Holy cow, somebody does that? You're kidding. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Like rewarding the progression through the curriculum of training by certification or having HR actually mark in somebody's file that they've taken architecture analysis and code review and security testing and their black belt level 4. That's, you just go, wow, you guys do that? Wow. Yeah, well, we had people who didn't want to come to training. So we just said, if you want to raise, you better come to training. And HR now does it. Wow. So that's a rocket science thing. Let's pick a level 1 thing just so we can dig into the model a little bit more. There's something called establish SSG office hours. And notice the objectives on the left. Now, what you do when you go to management, and this is important for your future careers, you never go to management and say, we should do geek thing 4. They'll be like, geek thing, where'd you come from, right? Instead, you have to say, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could leverage teachable moments in the organization? Nobody's going to say no. Everybody's going to say, yeah, leverage teachable moments sounds like a good idea. You say, oh, well, in order to do that, we got to do geek thing 4. Now you're talking, right? So nobody says, we must have a static analysis tool. Instead, you say, don't you agree we should get rid of bugs that everybody knows about? You know, and that might be even a little too geeky. But it's this notion of objective that's really important. And there's a way of driving through this whole BSIMM thing, all in business speaky objective stuff, all the way to like motherhood and apple pie at the top. So nobody in their right mind would say, oh, well, I disagree, we shouldn't do that, you know. And that's an important part of getting one of these initiatives off the ground. And in fact, the people who run these initiatives, like Steve Lipner at Microsoft, are politically savvy, technically astute, and also able to speak business, understand what margin is, know how to justify the expense to an organization, and figure out whether or not the costs of what they're proposing are worth it before they propose it. So, you know, rare people. I haven't found a successful initiative that doesn't have one of these rare people in the middle yet, but that's just how humanity ticks. All right, so let's pick establish SSG office hours. Imagine we click on that one, and we go down into the paragraph, which describes the objective, the activity, and then gives an example. So in this case, the FSG offers the help any and all comers during an advertised lab period or regularly scheduled office hours by acting as an informal resource for people who want to solve the problem. The SSG leverages teachable moments and emphasizes the carrot over the stick, which was a thing that we observed that surprised the heck out of me. You'd figure in a regulated environment like a bank, you could say, find your bugs or we're going to fire you. But they don't do that. They say, hey, we got a new bug finding thing. Everybody come use it. We'll teach you how. Whoa, carrots and sticks, they all use carrots. Holy cow. Really interesting. And security guys, they're all about the stick. Not going to work. The first generation of CSOs that you knew in New York, none of them are employed now. They all use the stick. They're all doing something in the Midwest now at like insurance corporations. That's where they all move to, right? So this is an interesting thing, and the level of leadership at the CSO level now is completely different than it was even 5 years ago.
Too expensive to keep replacing people.
Yeah, sticks don't work. If you build an initiative around carrots, it's a lot better. So here's the example. Office hours might be held one afternoon per week in the office of a senior SSG member. Guess what? That's what Google does, right? Cool. And this was an activity that's so straightforward that when other people saw this activity in the model that they didn't do, they were like, dude, I'm so setting up office hours next week. Wow, what a great idea. And that's another great side effect of a model like this, is all sorts of cross-pollination. In fact, that was something that really didn't occur to me. You know, we gave a talk on this at RSA, and everybody goes to RSA, not because the talks are any good, because they suck, but just because everybody goes, and you have meetings out in the hall, or, you know, go drinking and hang out. That's where everybody gets together once a year to find out what's really going on. Very interesting social phenomenon, right? So the people that were in the BSIMM study sent us some email and said, hey, the BSIMM study was cool, we love our results, but we would like to meet those other guys. Could we all get together at RSA? And we were like, why didn't we think of that? Of course, we should all get together. And so they got to meet each other. So now when Brad Arkin has a problem at Adobe, which they're having some of lately, he can call up Steve and say, hey, Steve, how'd you do this at Microsoft when you guys were totally in the hot seat? What'd you do? And Steve can tell him. And they can leverage the stuff that Steve learned to figure out how to do things right at Adobe. Now, you know, Brad just got to Adobe, so he jumped right into the frying pan, or right into the fire, as the case may be. But he's got lots of good plans. Okay. There were some things that we observed that everybody does. These are the 10 things that everybody does. And you can see those activities right there. We wrote an article about the 10 things that everybody does too. Everybody has an advocacy role or an evangelist role. They would prefer to teach you how to do software security than to punish you. So they're not the cops writing tickets. Instead, they're the people who are here to help, which is an interesting thing. Everybody uses their own company history in their training courses with real examples of real security problems that that company actually had. Every company has code review tools. They all use some sort of static analysis engine. So these are things that, of the 110 activities, there were 10 that everybody does. Now the other thing you can do when you do something like this is you can build an average model. So you can see this spider diagram up here. The way this is computed is you take the data from all 9 companies and you say, I'm going to give them the high watermark score for their activities in that particular practice. If they did a level 3 thing, one level 3 thing, I'm going to give them a 3. If they didn't do any, but they did some level 2 stuff, they're going to get a 2. And you see how high watermark works? Now high watermark's very low resolution. It only failed in one case on this data set. And when we went to the company, it happened to be, well, I can't say who they were. We went to them and we said, hey, you got a 3 here, but you really just didn't deserve it. You deserved a 1. They were like, oh yeah, we thought you were crazy. But we crunched the data. It's a data-driven model. This is the average across all 9, this spider diagram. Now this is the 12 little spokes on the spider wheel are the 12 practices. You can compute yourself, which is the blue line, against the red line, and you can find out where you are either ahead of the average or behind the average. This is very interesting. This is a hypothetical data set. You show one of these spider diagrams to these guys, they were just absolutely flabbergasted and they loved it. They thought it was the coolest thing ever. Coolest thing ever. Because now they know that the stuff they've been working on for 10 years is related to what other smart people are doing too. And before they were just doing it by themselves around their own campfire. Wow. Spreading news like that is a good thing. You can get one level deeper. Now I'm going to have to wrap this up quick because it's 50 minutes, right? So here is a way of looking at the 110 activities and denoting whether or not you carry them out or not. You get a 1 when you do something, and you get nothing when you didn't do something. See the red things next to the yellow things? The yellow things are the 10 things that everybody does. If you don't do something that everybody does, defined as 8 or more, then you get a red square. Does that mean you should do it? No. It means everybody else does. Now, just because everybody else does it doesn't mean you should, right? Didn't that what your mom told you that, right? Remember? So that turns out to still be true, but the model can just crank along and suggest that maybe you should consider that. And remember the things in the spider diagram where you were slightly behind the average, like here in compliance and policy? Gosh, they got a 1 and the average is a little bit better than 2, level 2 stuff. Well, we can do a blue shift on compliance and policy, and we can look for activities where more than 5 or so people are doing that, organizations are doing that, and you should say, you want to shift your average quick, consider these 3 activities. Because everybody's doing that and you're not. So it might be a good idea. Now, it might not work. This is not a smart consultant. This is just a data-driven model. Now you can use this data to really construct a very smart software security initiative. And in fact, we've been doing that. I'm going to skip this slide. With 1 minute left, here's what I want to tell you about the model. We started out and released this model in March based on 9 companies. We released it under the Creative Commons, so you can use the data. You can use it however you want. Get the data and use it. You can use the model however you want. Our competitors can use the model. We don't care. It's about a yardstick, right? You can get the model for free at bsi-mm.com, and you can use it anyhow you want. We've grown the model. We started with 9. We've done 17 more. That's 23. We got 4 more underway. As soon as we get to 30, we're going to have statistically significant piles of data that we can slice and dice using math, You know, my friend Sammy has already been slicing and dicing things, and he shows them to me, and I go, Sammy, that's great, but if you run a Pearson coefficient on that, you're going to be unsatisfied because you don't have enough data. And he's like, oh. So as soon as we get enough data, we're going to do that. We did a study in Europe of 9 companies that's going to be released next month. The results are getting presented to the 9 companies next week. We released something called BSIMM Begin. The press release is going out tomorrow morning, which is a way of participating and considering a self-reporting version of only level 1 easy stuff. So you go to a website, you answer a few questions, and we're going to see if that works. We're going to gather the data, and we're going to see if the data is any good. And if it's not, we're going to throw it away. And if it is, we're going to talk about it. It's just a different way of doing it. And that is the big plan. I'm 36 seconds over time. But that is a real quick version of the BSIMM talk. So thank you. All right. Now they can turn off the recording doohickey and we can have a conversation, right?
Are there any questions?
Let's start with Spaff.
Yeah, I have one.
Please.
I don't know if you need a mic or not, but the array of the companies that the original 9 that you did,
Yes.